The room is quiet enough to hear the radiator ticking. Cigarette smoke hangs low, turning the single overhead bulb into a dull moon. Outside, Chicago is frozen in a winter that refuses to end. Inside, a decision is being sealed without contracts, without witnesses, without mercy. At the center of the room sits Al Capone, heavier than the men around him, his face unreadable. He does not speak. He waits. Across the table, a visitor from New York adjusts his cufflinks with deliberate calm. His name will one day be spoken as a legend, but tonight he is simply careful. This meeting will never appear in court transcripts. No reporter will write about it. There are no photographs, no recordings. And yet, what happens here will bend the future of organized crime in America. The visitor is Lucky Luciano. He has not come to threaten. He has not come to negotiate territory. He has come to recognize reality. Chicago is burning money faster than New York ever did. Prohibition has turned alcohol into gold, and Capone controls the refinery. Trucks move at night. Police look the other way. Judges hesitate. Entire neighborhoods depend on Capone's payroll, whether they admit it or not. Luciano understands systems. He understands that empires are not built by noise, but by alignment. And tonight, he is here to align. Capone finally lifts his eyes. The silence stretches just long enough to become uncomfortable. This is not a man asking for approval. This is a man measuring risk. Backing Capone is not a sentimental choice. It is a gamble with consequences. New York families are watching. Rivals are listening. Old Sicilian rules are already cracking under the weight of American ambition. If Luciano places his quiet support behind Capone, he is not just endorsing a man. He is endorsing a model. A new kind of mafia. Less tradition. More efficiency. Some accounts suggest the conversation is brief. Others claim it lasts hours. What is consistent is this. When Luciano leaves the room, Capone's position is no longer just local power. It has been acknowledged, validated, protected by an understanding that stretches far beyond Chicago city limits. No handshakes are photographed. No promises are written down. But an invisible bridge is built between New York and Chicago, a private understanding that reshapes alliances, enforcement, and silence. From this moment forward, Capone is not merely a Chicago problem or a Chicago king. He is part of a national equation. And Luciano knows exactly what that means. Because backing Capone also means accepting what comes with him. Attention, instability, and a future that will demand payment. The radiator clicks again. The smoke thins. The men stand. History moves on without ever announcing itself. The question is not why Luciano supported Capone. The real question is what that quiet decision will cost them both. To understand why that quiet understanding mattered, you have to step back into the machinery of America in the 1920s, a country officially sober, practically drunk, and structurally unprepared for the consequences of its own laws. Prohibition was not just a moral crusade. It was a market intervention on a national scale. Alcohol did not disappear. It reorganized itself. And the men who understood logistics faster than ideology became the architects of a new underworld. In Chicago, the blueprint had already been drawn by Johnny Torrio, a man who believed crime should function like a corporation. Violence was a tool, not a language. Torrio taught Capone that survival depended on restraint as much as brutality. When Torrio stepped back after an assassination attempt, Capone inherited not chaos, but infrastructure. New York, however, was different. Fragmented. crowded, bound by old country loyalties that no longer fit American streets. The Mafia there was still arguing about tradition, while money moved without permission. This is where Meyer Lansky enters the picture, not as muscle, but as mathematics. Lansky saw numbers the way others saw territory. He and Luciano shared a dangerous idea, that ethnicity should never limit profit, and tradition should never outrank efficiency. Together, they imagined something radical for its time, cooperation instead of constant war. But ideas mean nothing without leverage. Chicago had leverage. Capone's operation generated cash on a scale that forced New York to pay attention. Not admiration, attention. Because Capone's visibility was both his strength and his liability. He was loud in a world that was learning the value of quiet. Newspapers loved him. Politicians feared him. Federal agents resented him. Luciano saw the danger clearly. If Chicago collapsed under pressure, the shockwave would not stop at state lines. Federal enforcement would sharpen. Public anger would grow. And New York's fragmented families would be next. Backing Capone privately was not about loyalty. It was about containment. Records suggest that channels were opened, liquor routes coordinated, disputes smoothed before they escalated, introductions made rather than demanded. Nothing formal. Nothing traceable. Just enough cooperation to reduce friction. But this balance was fragile. Every alliance raised suspicion. Old-school bosses whispered that Luciano was abandoning tradition. Chicago rivals watched Capone grow untouchable and wondered who was shielding him. Law enforcement sensed coordination but lacked proof. And beneath it all, prohibition itself was becoming more dangerous. As profits soared, so did stakes. Violence was no longer spontaneous. It was strategic. Every move risked escalation. Capone needed legitimacy beyond Chicago to survive. Luciano needed stability beyond New York to build his system. Their interests aligned, but alignment does not erase danger. It concentrates it. Because if this cooperation became visible, it would validate the very thing America feared most, that organized crime was no longer local, no longer ethnic, no longer chaotic, but national. And once that realization took hold, the response would be relentless. This was the pressure building beneath that silent agreement. Not just money, not just power, but the weight of an entire system moving faster than the men who thought they controlled it. And in that pressure, one wrong decision would be enough to turn partnership into liability. Power does not announce its movements. It shifts quietly, through omissions, delays, and carefully chosen silences. After the private understanding between Chicago and New York, nothing on the surface appears to change, and that is precisely the point. Al Capone does not suddenly become more violent. He becomes more patient. Meetings are shorter. Decisions are slower. He delegates more than before, not out of trust, but calculation. Capone understands something most of his enemies do not. Visibility is a currency, and he has already spent too much of it. Shipments begin arriving with fewer interruptions. Disputes that once escalated into gunfire are redirected into negotiations held far from the street. Capone's men notice the difference even if they don't understand it. Problems that should have exploded don't. In New York, Lucky Luciano makes moves that appear unrelated. He reduces public conflict. He listens more than he speaks. He lets older bosses believe they still matter while quietly mapping who controls what, and who is expendable. The streets grow calmer, but the tension underneath tightens like a wire pulled too far. And in the background, almost invisible, Meyer Lansky tracks numbers that others ignore. He notices how Chicago money stabilizes New York operations, how shared interests discourage reckless behavior, how cooperation produces profit without headlines. Cause leads to consequence, because with stability comes expectation. Capone's success emboldens him. He begins to believe his system is stronger than the pressure building around it. He underestimates how much protection depends on restraint, and how thin that protection really is. Each newspaper headline, each public appearance, each smirk aimed at authority chips away at the patience of men who prefer to remain unseen. Luciano, meanwhile, watches carefully. He does not interfere. He does not warn. He understands that systems reveal their weaknesses only when stressed. And Capone, whether he realizes it or not, is becoming stress. Federal attention intensifies, not because of a single crime, but because of pattern recognition. Agents begin to suspect coordination beyond state lines. They cannot prove it, but suspicion alone changes behavior. Surveillance increases. Informants are pressured. Mistakes become more expensive. Inside Capone's organization, loyalty starts to fray at the edges. Too much money. Too many eyes. Too many men who believe they are protected forever. Silence becomes harder to maintain. And still the alliance holds, not because it is strong, but because breaking it would be louder than maintaining it. Luciano faces a growing dilemma. Supporting Capone stabilizes the present but threatens the future. Every day Capone remains the symbol of organized crime. Luciano's vision of a quiet, rational underworld becomes harder to sell. The system they are building demands sacrifice. The question is not whether something will break. It is who will be allowed to fall first. The shift does not come from a meeting. It comes from a reaction. On a cold February morning in 1929, Chicago wakes up to photographs it cannot ignore. Bodies lined against a wall. Headlines too large to soften. The event will be remembered as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, not because it is unprecedented, but because it is undeniable. No contracts are found. No signatures. Responsibility is debated, denied, and carefully blurred. Some say Al Capone ordered it. Others argue he was too smart to leave such fingerprints. What matters is not certainty, it is perception. And perception detonates everything. Public tolerance collapses. Politicians who once hesitated now compete to condemn. Federal agencies no longer argue over jurisdiction. They align. The question shifts from who committed the crime to how long this has been allowed to exist. In New York, Lucky Luciano reads the headlines with a different instinct than most. He does not see tragedy. He sees exposure. Capone has become radioactive. Whether or not Capone authorized the massacre is almost irrelevant. His name dominates the story. His image becomes shorthand for everything America fears about organized crime. Loud, untouchable, smiling at the camera. This is the opposite of Luciano's vision. Quiet support now carries a cost. Any connection, proven or rumored, threatens to drag New York into Chicago's spotlight. The invisible bridge that once protected Capone now risks collapsing onto everyone who helped build it. Luciano adjusts without ceremony. Channels go cold. Messages slow. Introductions stop happening. Support is not revoked. It is withdrawn by absence. No confrontation. No betrayal. Just distance. Capone feels it before he understands it. Allies grow cautious. Decisions that once sailed through now stall. The protection he believed was structural reveals itself as conditional. Meanwhile, federal pressure pivots. Unable to break the silence around violence, investigators focus elsewhere. Taxes, paperwork, numbers. The very language Capone never respected. Luciano notices this too. And he learns. Power does not fall because it is challenged head-on. It falls when the rules change. Chicago becomes a lesson. Not in ambition, but in visibility. Not in violence, but in narrative. Capone's greatest strength has become his final vulnerability. By the time Capone retreats to Florida, insisting everything is under control, the decision has already been made elsewhere. Not to destroy him, to let him stand alone. The system Luciano is building no longer needs a symbol. It needs insulation. And Capone, once the engine of the machine, has become the noise it cannot afford. This is the moment the balance shifts, not with a gunshot, but with silence. The fall of Al Capone is often remembered as inevitable, a cautionary tale with a clean moral ending, the loud gangster undone by his own excess. But inevitability is a story we tell after the fact. In real time, nothing about Capone's collapse felt orderly or certain. What broke him was not violence, and not betrayal in the traditional sense. It was abandonment by the system he helped prove was possible. When Capone is finally convicted in 1931, it is not for murder, racketeering, or bootlegging. It is for tax evasion, numbers on paper, signatures missing, income too visible to ignore. The irony is brutal. The man who built an empire on cash is undone by arithmetic. And behind that outcome is a quiet consensus. No rescue comes. No coordinated response. No pressure applied from New York. The bridge that once existed does not explode. It simply no longer supports weight. Capone enters prison as a symbol, and symbols are disposable. For lucky Luciano, the lesson is absorbed completely. He does not mourn Capone. He studies him. Everything Capone represented, charisma, visibility, celebrity, becomes a liability to be engineered out of the system. In the years that follow, Luciano helps formalize a new structure for American organized crime. Power becomes distributed. Decisions become bureaucratic. Violence becomes regulated rather than expressive. Names matter less than function. The modern American Mafia does not rise from Capone's success. It rises from his failure. Luciano himself will not escape consequence. Convicted, imprisoned, and eventually deported, he pays his own price. But even in exile, the architecture he helped design endures. A system resilient enough to survive the loss of any single man. Capone dies years later, sick and diminished, his mind eroded by illness, his legend inflated by memory. He is remembered because he was seen. Luciano is remembered because he ensured others were not. That private backing, quiet, strategic, never documented, reshaped organized crime not by creating loyalty, but by clarifying rules. Support would exist only as long as it served the system, and when it stopped serving, silence would replace protection. Power, in the end, did not belong to the strongest man in the room. It belonged to the one who knew when to step back, when to disappear, and when to let history take someone else. Because the most dangerous deal is not the one made in secret. It is the one where you believe the silence will last forever. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a turning point. And there are many more like it, hidden in history. Subscribe to The Untold Deal, where the deals that shaped the world are finally told.